law is the place where we can have disputes and we can have arguments and we can challenge very forcefully and powerfully our government in a way that is decent and that is civilized and that is public. We can express ourselves freely in this country. Those are not small things.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the podcast, The Thought Leader Revolution. I'm your host, Nikki Ballou. And boy, do we have an exciting, incredible guest lined up for you today. Today's guest is a personal hero of mine, shero of mine. She is somebody who has, quite frankly, through her entire career, but in one particular instance, stood up for what was right in the face of unbelievable vitriol. And that, to me, is the kind of human being we need on this planet today. I am speaking, of course, of none other than the one, the only, the legendary Marie Hennen. Welcome to the show, Marie.
Thank you. Wow, what an intro. I'm going to send that to my mom. Thanks very much. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you as well. So you've got a new book out, and it's called Nothing But the Truth, a memoir. And I'd love to talk about this book, but before we get into it, some of my listeners will know who you are because they're from Canada and from Toronto, but some of them won't. So why don't you tell us your backstory? How'd you get to be where you are today?
Well, I first of all, I'm an immigrant from the Middle East. I was born in Cairo, came to Canada with my family, and we settled here by the time I was about 4. I fell in love with the practice of law, the idea, I think, of what it meant to be a lawyer and the types of things you would be working with in elementary school. So as early as elementary school, I wanted to be a lawyer and I wanted to be a criminal defense lawyer. That was always my desire, my passion. And I was fortunate enough to have that exact career. So I've been practicing criminal defense work for about 30 years.
That's pretty incredible. I'm from the Middle East as well. I'm an immigrant from Iran myself. And I came in here to Canada when I was 14 years old. So I was a little bit older than you were when you got in here. But I'll tell you, I think those of us who come from immigrant backgrounds to a country like Canada, we tend to appreciate all the magnificence that this country has to offer. I say maybe even more so than someone who was born here because we know what back home was like.
Right. It is true. I mean, there is such opportunity in this country. Certainly, that's why my parents came. I'm sure that is one of the drivers. It's usually the drivers for most immigrants that leave everything they know, particularly our parents and their families and what they understand and what they've grown up with. And they take such an extraordinary risk to come to a different country. But it's always been driven by this idea that there is more opportunity here. And there is for women, certainly. And for many of us, it's a chance to have access to things, for them, they would just see in the movies.
It's very true. And I think it's important that everybody who lives in the West take a moment and really give it 2 cheers because the opportunities that are available for people here are nothing short of breathtaking. And this is a country, certainly Canada, where it doesn't matter who you are. You can be a man, you can be a woman, you can be gay, you can be straight, you can be of a particular religion, of no particular religion. This country gives you the opportunity to be able to make the most of yourself. And I think that's incredible and wonderful.
I think it is. You don't want to sugarcoat it. I talk a little bit about this in the book, actually, the sort of notion of the North American dream. Which isn't accessible to everybody. That is true. There is inequality in North America. That is true. There is a history that we need to wrestle with that is a racist history, Indigenous and Black Americans, that is very much a part of the fabric of our society. So you don't want to pretend that it is something that is not. But that having been said, there is education here. Women can excel, certainly more than in many parts of the world. We have opportunities. We have the opportunity to stand in the street and say, we disagree with the government, that we can go into a courtroom and challenge the government. We can express ourselves freely in this country. Those are not small things. And I understand there are many things that are not great as well, but I think certainly my family is extremely fortunate and privileged to live here.
And I would just say the same is true for our family. You know, we were Christians, still are Christians in Iran, which is a 99.38% majority Muslim country. And being a non-Muslim in Iran was not an easy thing, you know. Thank God nobody was trying to kill us for being non-Muslims like ISIS did, but nonetheless, it was not an easy thing. And over here, nobody bothers us for being Iranian. You know, I think I've experienced actual racism twice in my life here in Canada. Now, one of them was really not fun. It was at the hands of family court, but that's a story for another day. But nonetheless, I had the opportunity to fight back. I had the opportunity to clear my name. And I can tell you that wouldn't have been the case back home. And that's a wonderful thing. So we have that in common. But I'm actually very curious. What drew you to the law? What drew you to criminal defense law? Why is it such a passion for you?
Well, I think the law in general for me is a passion. It really structures how we govern ourselves, not only as a community, but how we can challenge our government, the laws. It's a place where the rules are clear and you can have a voice challenging those laws. And so all of that for me was very significant. I love the fact that we're dealing with such broad issues, and particularly in criminal law, there is such a wide range of issues. And I'm not just talking about the actual cases themselves. Obviously, they change and the subjects and facts are always different. But the subject matter, when you think about what the police can do when they stop you, when you think about when the police can come into your home, when you think about when the government can wiretap your phone, these are fundamental things. When you think about, for example, abortion being criminalized, when you think about the right to die, when you think about the ability to, for example, to legalize marijuana, these are all fundamental issues that affect our lives. And so the scope of the types of things that you were dealing with in criminal law were the sorts of things that were very fascinating to me. That's part of it. The other part of it, to be truthful, is it's suitable to my personality. I like debating. I'm a fighter by nature. This is a contained boxing ring, if you will. The rules are clear, but it works with the things that I think are important to me and my personality and how I would like to spend the day. And I love being in a courtroom. I love engaging with judges and arguing about law. I love the unpredictability of it and the challenge of it. So all of those things for me, and I had a really pretty basic understanding because I didn't have lawyers in my family. But the sort of sense, I think, of what I thought a lawyer would be and what a criminal lawyer would be just was always the thing I was interested in.
Yeah. You know, it's really wonderful to hear you say that, because I think even in a country like this, as you so readily acknowledge, there are problems. And the government doesn't always get it right. In fact, the government quite often screws it up. And even well-meaning people who are agents of the government quite often screw it up. And it's important to have someone like you and many someones like you out there defending the interests of people who are caught up in a web of the government's mistakes, or in some cases of the government, quite frankly, not even making a mistake, deliberately misrepresenting itself because it fits their narrative.
It's very true. You know, it was interesting. I was listening to a podcast this morning, actually, about one of the last living prosecutors. I think the last living prosecutor from the Nuremberg trials, that was the prosecution of the Nazis. He was a young man when he ultimately, he's 27, when he's asked to do a prosecution of the murder of 1 million Jewish Germans. And he talks about that. He's 101 years old. And the one thing he said that really resonated with me is that his life mission was to replace war with law. And I think that is such a profound statement and so important, because law is the place where we can have disputes and we can have arguments and we can challenge very forcefully and powerfully our government in a way that is decent and that is civilized and that is public. It's so important. And when you think about countries that are lawless, countries that decide to have, corrupt judges, corrupt systems, prey on the weak, prey on the marginalized. It depends on who you know, and have no accountability to courts. Those systems are corrupt systems. Those systems are not good places to live. And so I just think the law is such a fundamental place for us to have disputes, decide who we want to be, decide as a society, challenge our thinking in a really thoughtful and deliberate way.
Yeah, well said. Well said. So, Marie, let's dive into the book, shall we? What made you decide to write a book?
It's a great question. Well, I didn't want to write the book for the longest time. I had been pitched to write a book. And I think people always want you to write the basic thing that you expect from a criminal lawyer, which is I'm going to write about all my cases. I just wasn't going to do that. It's not something I'm interested in doing. And I just don't think it's necessarily fair to have a lawyer deconstruct their clients and their witnesses and the witnesses after the fact. Because, people who are in the criminal justice system don't join it voluntarily, both as witnesses and as clients. They're drawn into it against their will. And so I just didn't think I wanted to write about that. But the second thing is, if I really was going to write about everything, you'd have to talk about things that ethically I'm not allowed to talk about. I can't breach my client's privilege. I can't discuss things that didn't end up in evidence in court. So there are limitations as to how helpful I thought those sorts of discussions would be. So for a long time, I thought I didn't have anything that I really wanted to say. But ultimately, I decided that there was something that I did want to say, which is my views, first of all, who I am, because I think people have only see you in a two-dimensional way when you're in the public. And I understand that. They're just seeing you walk into court and out of court, and they see what you do in court. And I didn't want young lawyers in particular, or young women, to get the message that you had to be this sort of tough, unreal, that's not real, any of it, person. And that would dissuade people from coming into the profession and thinking that I'm something that I'm not. So I wanted to just give a more full explanation of why I am what I am, who I am, to just share a little bit of that, to share a little bit of my personal story in the hope that it would resonate, because people would come and say, oh, you got to tell your story. It's so extraordinary. And I'd say, well, it's not extraordinary. Actually, it's the story of so many immigrants in this country. It's actually a story that is fairly common. And I finally found a publisher that saw that perspective and was going to allow me to write it from that perspective. So that was one. And there were things I wanted to say about the justice system that were important to me, and things I wanted to say about women in this profession.
Wonderful, 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 wonderful. So let's get into it.
Okay.
So tell me, what do you talk about early on in the book?
Early on in the book, I wanted to share the story that I know the best, which is my own story. And I found that every time I was trying to write about myself, I'd begin a chapter thinking I'm writing about one thing, and I end up writing about people in my family. So the structure of the book early on became very clear, because it sort of emerged that if I was going to tell you, for example, why I love fashion, I needed to tell you about my uncle. I needed to tell you about Sammy. If I was going to tell you, the feeling of being an outsider in those early years, I needed to tell you about my grandmother, my tita. If I wanted to tell you about why I am what I am in terms of commitment to my profession and being independent as a woman, I couldn't tell you that part of me without telling you about my mother, because that's going to explain to you why I am what I am. So I found that for me was how I was able to tell my stories, telling you the stories of these people in my life that were significant and important to me.
So let's talk about your mother, because it sounds like your mother really helped shape you and your worldview in a big way.
Yes, she did. She came from the Middle East, and, she came from a country where women had largely one path, which is to get married. As soon as you were of an age to be marriageable, it was time that you get married and start a family. And that was not my mom's aspiration. She did not think that that was what she wanted to do. She wanted to be free. She wanted to travel. She wanted to be independent. She's always wanted that independence. And she did not have that. She couldn't go out unless she was chaperoned. And so I grew up in an environment where my mother did not want me to have that experience. She was so fundamentally resistant to that sort of constraint on me. And she felt that the way that I would be liberated from that is if I was educated and independent. That independence was the fundamental key to the ability to choose. And that meant, intellectual independence, financial independence was fundamental to her. So that, of course, she shaped my worldview because I never saw myself in any other way than being independent and being focused on what I wanted to do with my life. So I didn't grow up being told, you're going to have a family, you've got to get married. That just wasn't uttered in my house. The only thing I was told was, what are you going to be? What are you going to study? What are you going to do with your life? How are you going to be independent? And so that's what I knew. And I was so fortunate because I think as I've come out of that, I realized not everybody has that message being told to them. But that was the message. That was my message growing up. I didn't know any. I didn't think it was strange. I thought that was what everybody thought.
Fantastic. Honestly, that's fantastic. When you're telling the story, I think back to my own childhood growing up, and what your mom told you and what your family told you is what my family told me. Hey, what are you going to study? What are you going to do? What are you going to be? I mean, it's like the Middle Eastern parents' mantra.
Yeah, it's lawyer. Well, back then, engineer, doctor, farmer. There were only a few, right? Lawyer wasn't so highly regarded in the Middle East, but certainly here. But yes, it was about the opportunity of education. It really was, and the opportunity to be independent. And as a woman, that's what I focused on. That's what I thought I was supposed to be doing.
That's fantastic. So you mentioned your grandfather. Tell me about your grandfather's influence on you and your worldview.
It was my grandmother.
Your grandmother,
who was the most
sorry.
Influential. Yeah. My grandfather was a classic Middle Eastern grandpa. Like, he's very quiet and, just wanted to do his stuff. But my grandmother was, again, a person who was very upbeat, very dynamic, very adventurous. She did not like being in the house, and yet much of her life was being in the house. Much of her life was cooking and cleaning and living a very traditional life, and she did not like any of it. She was great at it, but it was not the thing that she enjoyed. And so again, here is the other, woman in my life who was encouraging me to go out, to dress up, to enjoy myself, to not be so serious all the time. She was not a person who was serious. She was encouraging me to enjoy myself and never would say to me, oh, as a young woman, you shouldn't be doing that. So she was it was a very matriarchal household. And she was this person who was full of energy. And once again, what I saw was somebody that was very frustrated with the limitations that were imposed on her. And so again, always encouraging me to just, do my thing.
As I listen to you share that story, it again makes me think of my own upbringing. My household was also very matriarchal. Now, my dad was an alpha man and, the greatest man I ever knew, and God rest his soul, phenomenal man. But in the house, mom was boss. Mom chose to bring us out of Iran to Canada. Mom chose where we went to school. Mom chose, where we went to summer camp. Dad provided the money, but mom chose everything for us. And the women in our lives growing up were the ones who basically gave us the lessons and the upbringing. I spent time with my father and I learned a lot from my father, but he worked a lot. He just wasn't around much.
No, like my dad too. I mean, he worked 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 at night at the pharmacy. He was the pharmacist, and it was 6 days a week, actually. I remember the very first time he would take every 2 weeks a Wednesday off. It was a big shock for us. But, until I was 15 or 16, we didn't have dinner with my dad because he was working. But he is a powerful influence. He's a very intelligent person, profoundly intellectual. He was the one who had encouraged my love of arguing, and it's a Hennen trait, and debating and literature. And again, as a Middle Eastern father, he never shut that down. He would debate with me. I remember my mom would often say, like, don't let her argue with you like that. And my dad would say, no, it's good, it's healthy, and it's appropriate. So again, I just grew up in a dynamic where my parents were extremely progressive, quite liberal, and wanted to take advantage of everything that this country offered, particularly the freedom part of it. The freedom of it was very important.
Fantastic. So you tell your story early on in the book. Where does it go from there?
Well, the next section, because it's divided into sort of the beginning of my life, the next section really is my career in law, how I come to law, my work with Eddie Greenspan and Mark Rosenberg, how I started my own practice and firm. I talk about that. And I talk also about the justice system in a number of chapters to, I hope, try to demystify a little bit of it, to try to explain it. When people see, for example, flashed on the news what the jury didn't hear, well, they must be wondering, why on earth would a judge exclude evidence that may be relevant or that may be probative? So I try to sort of explain a little bit about what it is that you're seeing us do in court. I think it is so important to engage with the public and at least give them information, and then everyone can come to their own decisions after that. That's where the book goes, where it talks really about the justice system and my career and my work.
So let's talk a little bit about Eddie Greenspan. I find him a fascinating character, right? I mean, you got to work with him, and he's a legend in Canadian criminal law.
He is.
And he passed away a little while ago. Tell me, what was Eddie like?
Well, as I say in the book, I had always dreamt of working for him. I really, when people would ask me in university, where do you want to work? I'd say Eddie Greenspan. There was not an option two for me. And when I applied for an articling position, I thought it was a lousy interview. I didn't interview with him, and I walked out, and I cannot tell you how utterly devastated I was. And I thought, if I don't get this job, I just didn't know what I would be doing with myself and my career. Because for me, he was the epitome of what a defense lawyer needed to do in resolutely defending their client. He was everything I thought a defense lawyer needed to be. So I was fortunate to work with him for 11 years and to become his partner at some point in my career. And he was brilliant. He was intuitive. I think when people saw what he would do in court, they're seeing the end product, but they don't understand how incredibly thought out it is, how there were moments which you cannot teach, which are intuitive. He had an assessment of a case, of the heart of a case, which he could do in about 10 minutes. He just had a feel for it that is very, very unique and very, very special. And, I got a front row seat. I knew exactly what was happening. I knew what was planned and what was not planned. And it was, a great deal of talent.
Yeah, I mean, I followed his career through the newspaper when I was growing up. But I was, what's a testament to the man's brilliance is later on in his career, when Conrad Black was faced with all those charges in American courts, he hired Eddie to be his lead lawyer and to basically hire all the American lawyers that were going to defend him. And I read Conrad Black's account of all that, and he talked about why he hired Eddie. And he said that I hired Eddie Greenspan because I knew him, he was brilliant, and I knew that even though he didn't necessarily know American law, he knew enough about what a good lawyer was all about that he'd help me get the right American lawyers. And he was brilliant enough in front of a jury that I could trust him to have my best interest at heart. And I thought that was pretty incredible.
Well, it's true. I think it was Dominic Dunn who was covering the case, of famous former crime reporter for Vanity Fair. And, his description of Eddie's work in court was that he was dazzled by it. This is a person that's seen every great American lawyer in the country. And he couldn't miss, he couldn't miss what he was seeing in Eddie in court. And so, he was a profoundly talented, unique lawyer.
Yeah. So, Marie, what are some of your thoughts on the justice system in Canada, on what's good about it right now and what's not so good about it?
Well, look, I think what's good about it is the thing that I always thought is good about it. Probably the most valuable thing, most significant thing is the independence of all the actors. And I think we take it for granted in Canada in particular, and we don't understand the comparable. So let me just talk about judges. First of all, judges are not elected, they are appointed. There are different ways they can be appointed, and there are some criticisms of how they are appointed. But at the end of the day, we do not have judges that run for re-election as they do in the United States. So can you imagine if a judge had to run for re-election? In other words, what they had to do was to acquiesce or pander to what the popular or populist views were. So, tough on crime or get tough on this or support that. They become politicians, not objective judges. In Canada, we don't have that. We do not have judges that run for re-election. They're appointed. And in their appointment, they're now secure that they will do what they believe to be right. That is so valuable because an independent judge is essential to your ability to walk into court and feel you'll at least get a fair shake. We have an independent prosecutorial system. Again, very much unlike the United States, actually. Yeah. Here in Canada, it's part of the British tradition, our prosecutors view themselves as ministers of justice. What that means is they owe an obligation to the witnesses, to the complainants, to the victims. They owe an obligation to the accused person, but they also owe an obligation to the public. And so they don't come in with a win at all costs mentality. They come in with very much a view that they have to be fair. And I've dealt with a lot of American prosecutors, and I can tell you that is not the mindset that they bring to a case at all. It's very different, unfortunately. So we have that. We have an independent defense bar. We don't do a very good job at all of funding them through legal aid, which is really a very, very sad state because these are the people that stand beside the most marginalized, the most indigent. And so if you want a perfect system, or as perfect as it can be, you want everybody to be at the top of their game. But all those factors are so critical and are so valuable, and they've always existed, and we should do everything we can to always safeguard them. But what are the things that we need to change? Well, one of the most significant things is the overrepresentation of Indigenous community members. They're overcharged, they're over-incarcerated, they are marginalized, and they are marginalized throughout Canada. They are certainly marginalized in the justice system. That is something that we have not done remotely a good job of addressing and finally ending. I think we can do a little bit better when it comes to being creative about how we deal with criminal justice and how we think about it. We can think of restorative measures. We can think of different ways and not just be focused on punishment, but focus on rehabilitation, focus on reconciliation. There are a lot of ways and a lot of countries that are thinking differently about certain types of crimes like drug crimes and those sorts of things. We can do that. We can do so much better in that front. And at the end of the day, we have a lot of work to do in progressing, and we have. You think of the laws in the 1980s, and then you think of where we are today. There's been a lot of progression in dealing with certain offenses. Sexual assault offenses would be one area where we've come a long way. It doesn't mean we don't have longer to go, but a very long way in rethinking how we approach it. So there is just, again, this is why, to go back to what you asked me, why do I love law? Because it is so dynamic. It's so reflective of who we are, and it's capable of response and change. And it may be slow and it may be painstaking, but it is capable of it. So those, I think those are the good things and the bad things in our system.
Well, I'll tell you, I went through a rough divorce in 2009. My then wife, seemingly out of the blue, decided she didn't want to be married to me. And it was not fun at first. You know, right now we get along terrifically well. In fact, well enough that we go on vacations with our kids together and our new respective spouses. So we've got a great relationship now. But it wasn't good then. And I'll tell you, the system, me being from the Middle East, the system was looking at me differently because I was from the Middle East. That was one of the times that I told you I was, not happy with the racism shown by the system. It wasn't a racism shown by my ex-wife, but it was a racism shown by the system to a Middle Eastern man. And because he's from the Middle East, he might take his kids to Canada, so to Iran, and so therefore there were some rulings that came down that prevented me from even being able to be with my children. And it was absolutely awful and terrible. And before that, I'd never had any sort of brush with the law of any kind, family law, criminal law, or any of that stuff. And then I got into it myself, and I met quite a few other men. And I'll tell you what horrified me was that year I spoke to she was a paralegal. And I was speaking to her when I was going through this, and she was a friend of mine. And I said, "What's going on? Why is this happening to me? Why are they saying all these things about me?" She says, "Well, it's the dirty little secret of the system. You're a man and you're from the Middle East. And here's the truth. A lot of family lawyers go tell their clients, listen, go say this, this, and this about your ex. It'll give you a leg up in court." And the horrible thing about that was that this paralegal told me about half of those men didn't have the funds to be able to fight back, and they just accepted charges being thrown their way, and they acquiesced to them, even though they were completely innocent. They lost the right to be with their children. Many of them had to have some sort of a record as a result of this. And I got to tell you, it made me really angry, really, really angry. And I don't mean the momentary anger. I mean the righteous anger of somebody who's been aggrieved by something that's fundamentally unjust. And that's one of the reasons that I started a men's organization. I joined an existing men's organization. I'm all about helping men, become better men, not mess up their relationships. Certainly, I've been working on that in my new relationship, so I don't mess that one up. But I also want to make sure that, we have a society where both men and women are honored before the law, and there's no actual gender discrimination against men just because they're men in family court. Because that's what I experienced. And it was a horrible thing.
I understand that, but let me give you a bit of a different perspective, because it is important. I appreciate that you were experiencing that and that was your perspective. And I certainly hear you on assumptions that are made about cultures that litigants come from, how a Middle Eastern man would behave or all sorts of things like that. So I do understand that. But I think we do have to look at how family law worked historically. And historically, it was the women that were in a very, very significant negative position. And that meant these were women who had no access to funds after being married because the law would not give it to them, that had no protection financially. The presumption was not protection for them and their children. It was the other way. The presumption was towards the male if he wanted to assert a custodial claim. And so you have to understand that the history that came from was not favorable to women. I think it is wrong to think that the system is now pitched against men because it came from a history that was quite different than that, actually. But I think what you're identifying, and I do want to spend a few moments talking about it, and I'm not a family lawyer, I've done a little bit of it, is that this is an area of law, family law, which, again, it's not necessarily always suitable for resolution in a war in a courtroom, right? It involves,
I agree with 100%.
So much emotion, so much life history. It involves children. It involves people who will have to hopefully find a way to deal with each other for the rest of their lives. And so many lawyers Martha McCarthy, who's a friend of mine, who's a very, very famous family lawyer here in Ontario, and many other family lawyers have been working very hard with court systems to ensure that instead of pushing people who are in such a distressed time in their lives where they're not seeing their children and not being able to communicate, that instead of pushing them into a war in a courtroom, we're taking it out and dealing with it in mediation and trying to resolve that process. So, it's a really good example where sometimes we have to rethink how we deal with issues, problems, and a courtroom isn't always the best place to end up. And certainly for families that sit there and have to deal with each other, it's one of the worst places to end up. So I'm glad to hear that there's a happy ending to that story, and I have no doubt both you and your ex-wife worked a great deal to bring yourselves there, all to the benefit of your children, for sure. And I think what we can do as a system and as lawyers and as a legal system is to try to help families through what is a period of extraordinary crisis and very intense emotion. So sorry, I know it's a long-winded answer.
No, it's a good answer. I appreciate
that. It's a tough area, and I just think it's not good to feel like that the system is sort of stacked against you. I don't think it is. I know what you're talking about, but I do think that it's important for really what we should be addressing is how do we deal with these issues in a different way that isn't so damaging to all of the participants and doesn't make people feel like they're not being heard. So, it's a tough question.
I appreciate that. And listen, we did end up in a good place. And I appreciate the past was very different than what it is now. But the pendulum was here and now it's here. Yeah. And we need to bring it back here to the middle because it's not there yet. There's a lot of good men that are being screwed by the system and they don't know what to do. I've had friends of mine commit suicide over this, because they didn't have another way. And I'll tell you this, these are some stats that are absolutely heartbreaking. One is that quite rightly, there are over 2,500 women's shelters in Canada. And this is a good thing. But the issue of shelters for men, there's one shelter for men in the entire country. One. And I'll grant you that men are the ones who probably commit more violence at a way higher rate than women. In fact, I've got some stats on that. But there is a lot of violence that's committed against men too. And for there to only be one shelter for men in the entire country, I think that's a travesty. And I think it's important that we come to a space where what you say happens, which is that we move away from war in court and war in life to a more mediated way to do things. And who knows, in some cases, you might even be able to fix the problems and fix the family. But it's important for us as a society to treat everybody the same, to treat everybody equally before the law. And certainly my experience wasn't that. I had to fight like hell to just get back to even. And the experience that far too many men that I've dealt with has been the same. And I'm not saying these guys are perfect, and I'm not saying I was perfect, but I think the system could have given us a better shake. And if it had, I think things, for example, in my own case, one of the things that was crazy was that I wasn't even allowed to communicate with my wife during the time where all this was going on. The way the court orders had come down was they considered me a threat to my kids and to my wife. I was not allowed to communicate with her directly or indirectly. And I can tell you, I think that's horrible because I don't have a history of violence, never had a history of violence. And I wasn't allowed to speak to my wife. And as a result, during that early time where there was a possibility for us to talk things out and maybe see if we could work things out, that was taken off the table. And for that, I got to tell you, I got some hard feelings toward the judge who issued those orders. I'm in a good place in my life right now, but I don't think that judge should have done that. That judge helped break up a family.
Well, I think it sort of goes back to what I was talking about, which is this thinking about the system in a bit of a different way and to try to understand what the needs are of all the parties and to sometimes agree that perhaps the court is not the best place for certain disputes to end up. And that's why, as I said, there are family lawyers across the country who are trying to rethink it, particularly when you've got high crisis, high intensity acrimonious circumstances, which, often, as you have experienced with the passage of time and with some assistance and guidance, people are navigated through it and come out on the other side in a much better place. I think that's what you want as a society. But I think it's about the creative thinking a little bit about, what is the right place for certain types of disputes, right? And how to deal with it. And, the other thing you're talking about, which many people feel, is that they're not necessarily being heard, and they're not understanding why things are happening. And that's part of the also challenge of the justice system, is to try to make it explicable, to try to explain why certain things are happening, to understand there are ways to challenge things if you don't agree with them. But look, I think what I will say is that there is nobody who's gone through the court process, whether it's a family law case or a civil case or a criminal case, that comes out saying, wow, that's how I want to spend most of my time. It's a rough place to be. It's emotionally traumatizing. It's distressing. It's financially depleting. It is. So really, and this is, I'm not trying to do myself out of work, but really it's sort of the last resort. It's not our first resort. So we should be thinking about all of these things that you've talked about and trying to see, well, how can we not end up in a courtroom? How can we try to figure this out? So, certainly in criminal justice, you see other countries doing this, not prosecuting people with drug addictions, and instead dealing with a very collaborative approach to provide treatment. Because sometimes you have to agree that, an addiction doesn't belong in a criminal courtroom, and we're not going to do a good job of fixing it. Just as with family disputes, putting people who have to share children together, pitted against each other in a courtroom, really should be a last resort for us. It really should be the final place if we can't think of anything else to remediate the situation. So, we have to think about our justice system, and we have to also take lessons, because there are different types of systems, and we can do different things and be a little more creative.
I agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think some of those approaches ought to be brought into Canada. And, it's interesting that you mentioned the good things about Canada's justice system. And one of the things that you spoke about was how prosecutors behave here versus how prosecutors behave in the United States. And I can't help but think about this case that's been in the news in the U.S. around that young boy, Kyle Rittenhouse, who was charged by a prosecutor over there. And I didn't pay a lot of attention to that story at the beginning. And I heard, okay, this is a hothead kid who took a gun into a situation and he shot a bunch of people. And the prosecutor, and then I started following it just a little while ago, because he reminds me of my 13-year-old son a little bit, the look on his face. He's got a little baby face. And I thought, oh my God, that could be my son over there. And I started to watch what happened, and I watched some of the videos, and I watched what the prosecutor was saying, and I'm going, I think this guy's lying. I can't believe it. I can't imagine a prosecutor would do that, but that's what it looked like. He wanted to win that case so badly, he actually didn't care what the facts were. And that's one of the things that when I was reading about Conrad Black's situation in the United States, he argued that the American justice system is fundamentally corrupt because the prosecutors there have no incentive to seek the truth. He said that they win 99% of their cases in court, while in Canada, they win under 60% of their cases when they go to court. And I thought to myself, thank God I live in Canada. Not that I'd ever want to be caught in a situation like that, but at least over here, I'd have a fair shot. Over there, I don't think I would.
What would be, I didn't follow that what the prosecutor was saying, but I did listen to a great podcast, about the prosecutors in the George Floyd case, and listening to how they chose to present that case and prosecute it incredibly effectively, and with a great deal of respect and strategy. It was very fascinating. It was really fascinating. And they were brought in actually to prosecute that case. One had never tried a criminal case. One was had extensive experience in as a jury lawyer. But look, there are different approaches and different ways. I think in Canada, you'll see that it's more restrained. The temperature is down a lot. We're Canadian by nature. We're just, that's our nature, and it's a good thing. We are a little more controlled and maybe a little less histrionic than often happens in the United States, where the temperature is elevated. But I think what you see is good lawyers, no matter where they are good lawyers. And so I was actually, fascinated to hear the prosecutors in George Floyd's case speak. They were strategic and brilliant in how they approached it. So I didn't follow what the prosecutor did in
It's a fascinating thing to watch the difference between Canadian criminal justice and American criminal justice. So, Marie, have you ever thought about what you're going to do after you finish practicing law? You're going to become a judge? You're going to run for office and implement some of these ideas?
No, you know what? I don't know what I'm going to do. The world is a big one. There are a lot of things to do and to work in. And, I've always been fascinated in international work. I would love the opportunity to be able to do that, actually, to work on in criminal justice on an international scale. That would be fascinating to me. But I don't know. Who knows? You never know.
I think that's fantastic. So the name of your book is Nothing But the Truth, a Memoir by Marie Hennen. I got to tell you, it sounds fascinating. I can't wait till my copy comes in. I can't wait to read it. It's wonderful to see somebody with your level of clarity and moral courage put together a book like this and to share your thoughts with the world. God bless you for what you do. God bless you for who you are. And thank you for standing up for what's right in this great country of ours. It's people like you that make me proud to be a Canadian.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's been an honor. And that wraps up another incredible episode of the podcast, The Thought Leader Revolution. To find out more about today's guest and her fabulous new book, the one and only Marie Hennen, go to the show notes at thethoughtleaderrevolution.com or check us out wherever you listen to this podcast, be it on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or Audible. Until next time, goodbye.
This episode has been brought to you by eCircleAcademy.com, the proven system to add 6 to 7 figures a year to your thought leader practice.